Well, during 2020, we've had a lot of interesting developments in our nation currently, some of which have wide social impact. But 100 years ago, in 1920, we had another movement that had some of the same features, and it was the build up toward the women's suffrage, that is to say, the right of women in the US to vote. So during our 2020 exhibit, we intended to help tell that story and put the Birmingham spin on it. In this part of the exhibit, people are introduced to some of what was going on in the US, some of what was going on in England, and some of what was going on in Michigan, but more specifically, how Birmingham figures into that. So let me just mention briefly that people in the exhibit can watch a video slideshow that helps put that into context and helps explain how the battle for women to get the vote is just one part of their efforts for equal treatment and equal rights that has gone on for centuries and still is going on all over the world as just one social group among many who are striving to be treated with equal rights under the law. In 1913 in the US, there was a major push, but it was 1920 before women actually got the federal right to vote. And one of the big shifts actually happened because efforts went from a statewide, like piecemeal process to an entire federal process, and that's when things really changed. In Birmingham, our very favorite Martha Baldwin, who is one of our heroes, has had a lot to do with the local as well as the national effort for women to get the vote. But it wasn't, not everybody wanted women to get the vote, and we also talk about that in this exhibit. If you want to find out more about what we have on this slideshow, it is available online right now. If you go to the museum's webpage, under current exhibits, and you go to that page, there will be a link that will help you play the slideshow if you want to. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you here and telling you more about the women's rights movement, past and present, and Birmingham's role in it. Martha Baldwin was one of many women in Birmingham that was interested in seeing women's rights advance, but she actually was able to take it to the level of conference attendance and working on committees. And so she joined the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association in 1901, and she was a member until 1913, which was when she died. And we had some fun with finding out that she was actually somewhere in this picture, which was of their 25th convention. So everyone at the convention, she was an officer and a committee worker, so we know she's here. And so just for fun, we offer people the opportunity to look for Martha in the crowd. And Martha did an incredible amount of work on behalf of women, children, families, and public health. This is just one angle. So stop by or give us a call and we can tell you a lot more about Martha and the impact she had on everyone's well-being.
Welcome to the kitchen here in the Allen House, and what you're seeing today is our exhibit on the World War II at-home efforts. Women and gentlemen and a lot of kids would not have been overseas fighting in the war, so what they did is they stayed home, but they contributed in their own ways. One of the biggest ones was with food rationing. At this time period, France is completely bombarded, England's getting bombed. We have to send a lot of food over to our allies. So people here don't quite have the food that they would have pre-war or after the war. So rationing is put into effect to make sure that everybody at home has food. People would be given these little war ration books, one per family. And you would use these little coupons to get your food from the store. A lot of newspapers like the Eccentric, we have some examples hanging on the wall on how to use the food rationing tickets, because it could get a little confusing. But another way that women and the gentlemen left behind and the children could get involved was gardening. Victory gardens would come about in World War I, but they really took off in World War II. Not only were victory gardens in your own backyard, but Shane Park and other parks around Birmingham were turned into plots plowed by farmers, and the plots were given to families who filled out an application so that everybody, even if you didn't have a nice backyard, could have a victory garden. One of my favorite stories about the victory gardens, however, were the hungry bunnies. So Birmingham had a bad bunny problem. Of course, everybody knows that bunnies love vegetable gardens. And it wasn't just a Birmingham problem, it was actually a state problem, which was brought up in the state legislature. But here in Birmingham, there was a Councilman Moody who declared himself as the arch nemesis of the bad bunnies of Birmingham. And at one point in a council meeting actually recommended that the police just open fire on bunnies right in the middle of the city. Well, of course, other council members were like, yeah, we're gonna table that idea. And instead what they ended up doing is using a brush cleanup program. So retired gentlemen would go around and pull out all the brush and clean up any lots or homes that had too much brush. And well, that solved the bunny problem without having to go shooting up town. And another way that women would help to save food was canning and wartime recipes. These recipes would use substitutes for meat that would be sent over to the war effort. And some of them are a little odd. We might not like them. One of my favorite recipes, of course, is a cheese and ketchup sandwich. And you take and grate American cheese, you add tomato ketchup, you use some Tabasco sauce, minced onions, and you cream it all together and throw that on some bread, and that would be lunch. But canning was also big. They had canning parties, and we have a beautiful pressure canner here from the 1940s that people could help preserve their own foods at home. So through gardening and rationing, canning, and really being careful with what you cooked, those who had to stay home and could still help out with the war effort here in Birmingham. So in this part of the exhibit, we are talking about Birmingham women's contributions to the public sphere from post-World War II to about the present day. And these women were pioneers in so many fields, from aviation to politics, art and design, and rock and roll journalism. So it's really awesome kind of seeing women come out of World War II and have all these freedoms, have all these options open to them, and they're really just grabbing it and running with it and doing everything that men could do, and a lot of times better. So one of the women that I've really enjoyed getting to know as part of this exhibit is Florence Willett. Her nickname was Twink, so sometimes you'll hear her referred to as Twink Willett. She was Birmingham's first female mayor, and she was one of the first female mayors in the state of Michigan. So kind of a trendsetter in a lot of different ways. And she dealt with a lot of the same things that female politicians today have to deal with. They're constantly trying to prove that, they are feminine, they are good mothers, they are good housekeepers. Her clothing was always scrutinized. The hats that she wore, consistently scrutinized.
when people interviewed her, they always had to, include something about like, oh, well, what about your children? Tell us about this and that. So I think that a lot of women today, with the pressures that we're under, we can kind of look at that and see that, things have changed, but maybe not everything has changed.
All right, we're in the big room here at the Allen House, and this section of our exhibit concerns women who held office after they gained the right to vote in 1920 when women won suffrage. We have quite a few women who would serve in the city of Birmingham. Today I would like to focus on Hope Easter Ferguson Lewis. She would be the first woman elected as a councilwoman to the village of Birmingham. She was elected in 1927, and she would serve several years on the board. She would be one of the people responsible for helping to get the municipal building, the Baldwin Library, and Cheyne Park, that whole kind of complex there. It was during her time that she was on the city council that they pushed for that to be done. She would then move on to be at the community house and work with the community house for several years. When she left that, she ran her own business, Diety Diaper Service, throughout the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. But as she grew older, she really felt the need to come back to politics. And she would move to the Oakland County Board of Supervisors. She would also be assigned to the Board of Trustees, and then finally the Board of Institutions. She would continue doing this well into her 80s, serving not just Birmingham, but also Oakland County. So even though we had quite a few women, including Mary Utter and Viola Grant and Ruth Shane, working in Birmingham government, I really feel a connection to Hope Ferguson because it wasn't just for fun, it was her life.
So in this part of the exhibit, we are talking about women who were active in Birmingham from 1870 to about 1900 in the lead up to World War I. And so this is the time period after the American Civil War, all the social upheavals that followed. And so we have a room for Martha Baldwin getting involved with the Ladies Library Association and the evolution of the Baldwin Library that we know today, to artists and entrepreneurs and immigrants. So one woman that I had a lot of fun researching and I was really interested in is Giddel Levinson. And she arrived in the US from what is now Russia in the late 1800s. She didn't know English, she only knew one person in Detroit, and later on she marries a man named Morris Levinson, and they moved to Birmingham and they opened up the first department store in Birmingham, and they were religious minorities. They were a Jewish family living in Birmingham, so the first Jewish family in Birmingham, and I think their story just really emphasizes that immigrant story. Even if you are looking at a community, you might not see it, that story is there underneath the surface. And the railroads at that time allowed families like the Levinsons, who might like to, cook traditional dishes during holidays, allowed them to travel from Birmingham to, say, kosher markets in Detroit, buy what they needed, and come back up to their families. So at this time, with the railroads, you really saw a lot of people branching out. They weren't just staying in those urban centers. Suddenly now they had the freedom to live and work elsewhere and still have what they needed to celebrate their lives and live their lives. So I found that really, really interesting.
When it comes to Birmingham's story and how women figure into it, the best recorded information we have begins to show up in the pioneer period, which is after the War of 1812, when settlers first came to this area. We know that the area was occupied by Native Americans, but we have no recorded documented history about them, so we can't say very much about them. And even the women who came originally with the pioneer settlers, we can't say a lot about in most cases, primarily because women were not, they did not have the right to hold property, own property, they could not vote, and they were basically considered sort of appendages of the men that they accompanied. They were important, don't get me wrong, but they were part of the John West Hunter family, and so the documents and whatnot would be related to the men. The one interesting thing we learned, though, about the pioneer women in Birmingham is that 3 of the main settlers, the most important first settlers here, all married 3 sisters, and they're known as the Prindle sisters. So we recently researched the Prindle sisters and found out more about them and how that factors into the early life of women here in the wilderness. This exhibit is really about what a woman's daily work might be like. And we have a lot of artifacts in our collection that relate to everyday work, and most of that was done by women, at least the artifacts that relate to food, clothing, and in some cases heating and shelter. Those were women's jobs. The Prindle sisters, Sarah, I have to look to be sure, Sarah, Margaret, and Olive were married to John West Hunter, his brother, Daniel Hunter, and John Hamilton. And so when they came here together, the one thing they could do is support each other. So as women have often done, helped each other out, we think these 3 sisters did the same. In this exhibit, we also explore what's really involved with making clothing and keeping the hearth warm. There's a lot more to that, and we hope that you will join us and learn more about what pioneer women faced, and you might find that it's similar to what modern women even face.